Today I got with me 3 Turing cops. We're gonna be a little bit fewer today, but how are you guys doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Doing pretty well today. How are you guys?
The hypervirus killed us. Everyone was killed by the hypervirus. Only we remain because we have the alpha genes.
Because we're all Hyperboreans.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Is it?
Well, I felt like I died almost 30 minutes ago, but now I feel pretty good.
The strong survive,
Yes.
the weak perish.
The strong survive, and the weak persist in misery, and the strong prevail. But here's the problem, right? What's our role in society anymore as, like, human subjects? Is there any space left for the individual to function as any kind of political and social agent?
Yes, it is. Only as a consumer if you buy our DLC exclusively on GOG or Steam or any other platform. Like consumerism is today the signifier of what I would say individual is. Your worth as an individual is your worth as a consumer. So to speak, you are tailored as an individual because you are a consumer. You exist because you consume, like this kind of perverse Cartesian approach using a very shitty accent.
Okay, well, I want to say something. I think there is a place for the individual, but only insofar as it relates to social credit points. And we are very, very displeased, and we have the unfortunate news that Big Bill Hell's Cars has decided to unsponsor us because, in quote, they weren't getting enough men to bring in their wives to fuck and buy cheap and very, very used cars. So it's a great loss on our part, but we still have the Central Committee concerning security of the People's Republic of China that still sponsors us, and still we are always loyal to Xi Jinping. Remember this.
Remember it is,
Of course, yes.
Xi Jinping also is a proud sponsor of the Atomwaffen chapter of Alabama. Remember, Alabama, the place where dreams come true, and incest is also true.
Speaking of broken dreams, how can we, with justice, kind of dissect the history of, individualism in general? Because I feel it's just a joke at this point. If you compare it to any kind of like video essay on YouTube or whatever. Do you have any thoughts on this, Brig?
We don't have lo-fi music for that.
Yeah, it's used more as a punchline these days than as presented as a genuine ideology.
Yeah, it's a cheap abstraction today. There's no longer the same sort of passion and vitriol which was argued with when it was first really formulated in the Enlightenment period. Now it's just something where we fall back upon it as some sort of manner of assumption, but we don't really genuinely believe that it exists. We will posit that individuality is always great for expression, that you should always express yourself, but there's always the tidbit, depending on where you are, where, well, your manner of individuality is not as great as mine because you are poor, you are uneducated, so on and so forth. So it's a good abstract ideal to have now, but as a metaphysical concept, not so much.
It's cheap, it's easy to make, it's easy to say because it has like a loaded history behind it. And right now, the history which it had behind it, the richness, the struggles and such have become completely aesthetic. They become completely empty and became merged to be sold and consumed. Like as I said before, you're an individual because you buy shit, because you are a consumer. It's enough to just open any kind of TV station, not any TV station, any program that talks about the market. It's not referring to people or as even economic subjects, but as consumers, which is kind of proud, the tilt to the voice. You exist because you buy stuff. You exist because you participate in the economic circuit. Outside of it, you aren't worth that much, even though we say that you're worth it. But it's just pure aesthetics, It's just lip service,
You know what?
so to speak.
What?
Before we get into the various forms of individualism that exist now, it's important for the audience to at least define and outline the characteristics and the evolution which it as a concept has taken on, because as Maestro said, it has an abundant and empowered history behind it, but to use it in a self-evident manner without explaining it in a way where individualism can be understood and the nuances of it, especially within consumerist culture, are outlined, it's very difficult for most people to conceive of. And at least in how I mentioned it, individualism has really, as a concept, predominated within the West since the Enlightenment period, but even before that, there's evidence and characteristics that it existed before pre-Enlightenment, before the people like Locke and so forth formulated it. So it's at least important to lay out in some manner a way and an understanding of individualism where it's not subject to linguistic games and to confusion and to various senses which can easily distract from the points which we're all trying to make here. So I want to present briefly at least a summation and a history of how individualism has evolved. Going back to the pre-Socratics even, you have people, for instance, Parmenides, Heraclitus, and Anaxagoras are the primary three who wrote about individualism, that spoke of the concept of being and the question associated around being as necessitating a form of individuality. There is a essence which was being abstracted between being and non-being, where as opposed to any form of monism which tries to include the entirety of metaphysics within one concept, each was individuated as a particular point. So in the case of Heraclitus, for instance, he uses the concept of a river, and that in every particular instance, when somebody enters the river and they leave the river and then they go into enter the river again, they do not enter the same river again, because each individual atom, as he posited it, has changed, and the river therein is not the same as it was before because it has had contact with a human being or an individual, which alters the composition of the individual river or the various atoms which go into it. So even from a perspective where the individual isn't used in a human sense, the individual was used in a manner to denote one. There is a singular entity which, in and of itself, abstracted from everything, was complete. So for non-being, for instance, it is defined as the void. It is the empty abyss. Well, to think of the nothing is very hard for the Greeks to do, and they have great difficulties trying to conceive of nothingness and of the emptiness. However, they still are able to conceive of the nothingness as a individual space where there's a large void which pervades. It has some sense to it. It has some space to it. It makes sense. There's a familiarity associated there. When you think of nothingness, you have something there by which to think of. You think of black emptiness. You think of an infinite space with no stratification, with no outlining or anything as representing this. All of this goes into the formation of metaphysics as we see it today. And this is important for people like Plato and for people like Socrates, because not only does metaphysics revolve around the question of individuality and how various concepts and various ideas are combined with one another in ways where the individuality they have pre-existing is defined and given greater coherence. They call it unconcealment in this instance, where a greater individuality is posited through the presencing and the revelation of this thing. Well, in the case of people like Socrates and Plato, they weren't just content to think of metaphysics as being the only space of individuality. They apply it to the human person for the first time in history. For someone like Socrates, the essence of philosophy and philosophizing is not only an individual practice, but it's an individual insofar as it relates to the whole Athenian polis, or the polis or the people who are associated with it. It is something by which the individuality and the national character, as you can think of it nowadays, is defined. And so when you read the Republic, as Plato describes Socrates, he doesn't conduct himself as every Athenian does. He has an individuality because he separates himself from it. He tries to capture and tap into what we would think of as a national spirit, what it is to be an Athenian, what it is to live within the polis, as opposed to just being unreflective and passive within how individuality is defined, where we would think of it as being, at least in modern context, of being an average Joe, where you don't stand out in any way. There's nothing to differentiate you between other people. And it's not even that individualism itself developed primarily from people wanting to posit themselves as different, but as a necessity to the formation of philosophy. Individuality has to exist for philosophy. Otherwise, philosophy can't go about in the various ways which it has done so. And then we get into people like Aristotle, who posit that individuality is better than the collective to some degree. And then you can look in stuff like, or not stuff, works like his metaphysics or his Nicomachean ethics, where the various forms of individuality are predicated not only upon the ability to philosophize, but the degree to which perfection is attained, continence versus incontinence, the good soul versus the bestial soul, or the virtuous soul versus the bestial soul, rather. And those forms of individuality don't necessitate in a form of expression. It's a composition of an entire worldview. It's an encapsulation of what Heidegger would consider being in the world in various forms in order to better articulate various senses of philosophy. So already we can see individuality giving greater clarity to philosophy than Aristotle's predecessors or Plato's predecessors did. But when you get into scholasticism and into Neoplatonism, the forms of continence and the perfections of the soul, the degrees to which virtue is attained, that isn't all individuality remains at. Individuality becomes not only a intellectual and a rational capability, as people like St. Thomas Aquinas would say, but there's also the Christian component which is factored in there. The degree to which one has attained salvation and the degree to which one remains within sin. So already we see individuality evolve from the pre-Socratics in the way that metaphysical concepts and ideals are developed, to how one who wants to philosophize by necessity has a form of individuality which they may not even actively posit. It's a reification of them trying to understand a sense, or what the polis is, what democracy is, the essence of trying to find an essence which most people take as self-evident, and then it takes on characteristics of personal actions. And now we stand up before us, as opposed to just personal actions and all that which has been said, there is a theological component there. It is completely and wholly up to the individual to decide whether they are saved or not, as opposed to it just being a decision whether they are virtuous or not. And here we really see individuality get its best clarity in the sense that we use it now, the self-evidence which individualism has today, where the individual person as an atomistic principle within a social framework or within a collective framework has the ability, the will, the intellect, the rationality to determine its own particular ends and its own particular composition, and thus appropriately manage it in that way. But what the Enlightenment philosophers saw was that this form of scholasticism was not only necessary, it was vital to the development of philosophy and how it relates to the individual person, but it didn't really encapsulate the sort of free will to which scholasticism had attributed to the the formation of individuality. Because in and of itself, if you take the omnipresence and omnipotence argument of God, then there's no true free will there. There's no true individuality. Yeah. There's compatibilism, which is what Catholicism adopts today, but there's no true free will. So they come to deal with this problem, and people like Locke, people like Rousseau, they'll posit that you can still keep a transcendental element there to the nature of how individuality exists, but as a particular concept within society, each single person, in the case of Locke, is a tabula rasa, but in the case of people like Rousseau, each individual person has a particular inclination towards beauty, towards essence. So it's a collection, or a reconciliation, if you will, of people like Aristotle and how they define individuality as being habitative, and being a culmination of study and particular ends and particular rationality, as well as a transcendental element. What Aristotle posits, for instance, as beauty, that is taken as a replacement for what grounds individuality in the sense of how people like St. Thomas Aquinas use God in this instance. So to give a very brief overview, which I said I wanted to do, but I also wanted to make it so that if anybody who is interested in individuality wishes to go and learn, they have a good framework to do so. It evolves from just relating to metaphysical concepts all the way into pertaining to the individual person as an atomistic principle, abstracted from the collective, a movement from collectivity and what would be considered generally as a form of concealment before unconcealment had occurred or presenced, into a form of it's a blooming. You can think of the Hegelian notion of the bud, the flower refutes the bud, and the fruit refutes the flower. That was the progression of individuality. And now we stand with a better grasp of what individuality is like, to cope with, to deal with, to discuss what individualism really means in not only the Enlightenment sense, but how it was carried on beyond the Enlightenment in various different ways.
And I mean, like, we can contrast that, like the historical development of it, and look at it from a more like modern, almost I would say humanistic, but more and so like scientifically and materialistically. Like when people try to understand the brain now, for example, which is probably the most individuating property of the human being. And here's where I'd like to differ from the people that have the idea of tabula rasa, right? That it's basically the idea that like a person is born without like predetermined characteristics necessarily, and that there is no like essence that defines human beings. It's not necessarily anti-essentialist, but the thing is, I'd like to turn that completely on its head without like, or rather contradicting it without its opposite. So, in fact, it's not that the human being has no characteristic that it's born with. I would say the brain and neuroplasticity as a key component of the development of the brain and the health of it is something that carries us, especially from birth, but all the way till we die, right? And if anything, the main characteristic that human beings are born with is a process of becoming, of changing, and then you have the entropic pruning of brain cells, and you never arrive at an essence besides the I guess the predetermining characteristic of neuroplasticity. That aside, there isn't really much to back up the idea of the individual as, I mean, any modern, I don't like to quote the psychologists or even the psychoanalysts at this, but if we keep it scientifically, then, for example, it's a moot point, but it's still important. You cannot find a center of the brain, or rather a kind of center of self, and you can't really call it holistic, as the brain itself is kind of schizophrenically developed with all of these parts of the brain connecting in different ways. There is no core to the self, but it's very interesting topic when you look away from the empirical data, because when you take, for instance, psychedelics, magic mushrooms or similar, you experience what many people call an ego death, and whatever you thought were yourself kind of gets disconnected and completely wiped out of the picture, and you feel this like interconnectedness with everything around you. Does this say anything about the validity of individuality, about the idea of the self? I don't really think so. If anything, it points to the fact that having like a selfless state or having an essence are neither predetermined characteristics. It's always in this like contradictory, dialectical, not linear movement, but some kind of movement, development. Bookchin goes way deeper into that, which I'm not going to cover today, but it's a lot more complicated than these two dichotomies. What did you want to say like about today's condition, or anyone else for that matter? You had a pretty good historic overview, Brig.
Yeah. I guess I could.
Gallow rates.
So I guess I was approaching this from sort of a Deleuzian perspective. So I guess I could explain a little bit. So generally, the what you'd call the individual is thought of as what is philosophically known as the Cartesian subject, which is, you know, presupposes a mind-body dualism. There's the transcendental mind and the body, which is immanent. And Deleuze rejects the Cartesian subject in favor of a impersonal and pre-individual transcendental field where the subject, as an identity pole, which produces empirical entities by active synthesis, is itself the result or product of differential passive syntheses, which could be syntheses of habit, such as bodily, desiring, and unconscious, which contractions, which unify sets of experiences, and extracts what will be retained in the habit and allow the rest to be forgotten. So what that means is essentially there's no central individual, like you say. There's not really there's not really a central person you can locate. It's really just sort of, as Deleuze says, this impersonal and pre-individual transcendental field where the subject is decentered and produces empirical identities through passive syntheses. It's not something that's necessarily conscious
or static, for that matter. I would say, like, it's like when you described it sounds more like the individual, or what is essentially, it's mostly like the only concrete thing we have of that is not like any structure or any formation. It's just a process through which the individual forms itself. Like, that is the only thing concrete that we can grasp, and say there is that thing, so to speak, instead of like trying to build these ideals of how looks an individual, what is essentially an individual. It's a topic which is heavily discussed, for example, in sociology too. For example, there are many views in sociology and in regards to what is individual, is there the individual is before the group, the social group, or is the social group the one which forms the individual? This is like an old debate, so to speak. This is the times of Max Weber and Emil Durkheim, which they took different points, which I highly suggest also to look them up, because they're very interesting in regards to that aspect. It's this complexity of the trying to pin concrete to something which is unpinnable concrete, because everything every social concept we humans develop is a concept bound by historicity. Thus, it's not an eternal concept. Thus, it decays. Thus, it rots. Thus, it changes. The only thing that remains concrete is the process through which these things form themselves. Yeah. That thing is something that is ever changing. It's never fixed. We cannot pinpoint it because it goes against the reason, so to speak, of it existing, if we pinpoint it into something specific, so to speak.
Yes, correct. I wanted to go back to at least the Cartesian subject. I have two comments on the Cartesian subject. The first is, since we're discussing the various approaches of philosophy, and since Gallowglass mentioned Deleuze, I think it's necessary to mention people like Henri Bergson, but also phenomenology. So for the phenomenologists, I want to use especially Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who deals a lot, especially with the formation of the self within, especially the neurobiological characteristics and the composition of what we take to be the self. So to use Maurice Merleau-Ponty, I'll just call him Merleau-Ponty now.
That French dude.
It's not so simple. Yeah, the French dude, the French dude who was hated by Sartre, and Sartre was envious of him. But nevertheless, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, he realizes that attempts by science, but also by philosophy, to pin down the self or the Cartesian subject within such a manner as to be concrete, not only misunderstands a bit of Descartes, but also tries to make it in such a state as to be as science would mirror. And so the way that Maurice Merleau-Ponty goes about trying to pin down the self, especially within phenomenology perception, which is his magnum opus, but you could also look in Sense and Nonsense, for instance, on what he says about it, is to try to be systematic about the formation of the self. It is fundamentally nonsense to do that. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to try to document piece by piece why certain neurobiological associations are formed. So, for instance, in how you conceive of a table, in discussing the essence of a table, this is how he starts off phenomenology of perception. You can be exhaustive with each individual characteristic of a table. A table has to have legs. It has to have some sort of function. It can be a writing desk. It can be an eating table, so on and so forth. No matter which way in which you try to position a table or a desk, it will always be incapable of exhausting the essence of the desk and how you define it. And he says that by and large, in how your brain or your neurobiological functions form the association, is that an attempt to conceive of a desk likens back a very complex, a very vivid and rich imagery of how the desk is situated. You could have the desk that you grew up using, the desk that you write on, the desk that you sit at during school. Regardless of how you form it, the object to which you are trying to look is by and large blurry.
Yes.
It is not supposed to be clearly defined. It is not supposed to have a characteristic outline. There is supposed to be some blurriness within there. There's supposed to be a gray zone within there. Because in nature, you are taking the millions upon thousands, however many times you've seen a desk, and you are trying to compress it within one phenomenological time horizon. You are trying to crunch it into one individual ball. And what you are performing here is, as Husserl calls it, an eidetic reduction, where you are taking the accidental characteristics of a table. So the table could be metal, it could be wood, it could have 5 legs, it could have 3 legs, it could have 1 leg. Regardless of that, you are taking away all of the characteristics there, and through the process of eidetic reduction, you are leaving what is called an essential necessity there. You are leaving what you believe to be the absolute bare minimum of what you conceive of a table as being. In the case of the self, this is what happens when you try to abstract the concept of the self. Because you could take away all the individuating characteristics, as one may call it. For instance, this person has Asperger's, this person has schizophrenia. These people have different mental conditions, which by and large make them aneurotypical and condition certain associations there. And you try to have what is called the Cartesian subject, that which is supposed to be absolutely grounded. And he says that the way that Descartes was using this is he was not necessarily trying to ground the entirety of philosophy upon the abstraction of the self, or of the self as the absolute subject. Because the way that he was doing this is in his methodological skepticism, as you call it, or methodological doubt, depending on which way you have it, the reduction of essences, or trying to find the essence of essences, runs into the inherent problem, which phenomenology is, until its development, the only form of philosophy to pick up. When you try to remove the external world, you try to doubt the external world, you try to doubt God, you try to doubt everything which you take to be philosophical by nature, you are left with what conception you have of the self. Because by and large, you can believe that you don't exist, but the way that Descartes gets around this is he says, if you were to smack yourself in the face, you would cognize it. You would be absolutely certain that happened because it impresses upon yourself. So in the formation of the self within Merleau-Ponty, but also people like Husserl, Ricoeur, Derrida, when he was a phenomenologist, those people, the slate by which we take the self, it has to by and large be an abstraction, because to have a vivid understanding of how consciousness works, how the self works, how Dasein in the Husserlian sense as opposed to the Heideggerian sense works, the eidetic necessity, or the absolute necessity of how the self is functioned, there's so many accidental characteristics, so much that you can go into it, so much social factors, as Maestro said, all of these external factors which obfuscates what the self would be considered as. And so within phenomenology and within people like Maurice Merleau-Ponty, you have to take the self as being by and large individuated only by what it takes on, not that the self is inherently supposed to have these certain characteristics and have these associations, because like AngryTeapot mentioned, the way in which the brain works is fundamentally irrational. The associations it makes, the formations it works. If you were to conceive of an ideal day, nobody will have the same ideal day. Nobody will have the same understanding of it. Nobody will have the same weather pattern even, because it is wholly individualistic. It is wholly subjective and not in the form of subjectivity, which Descartes uses, to your own phenomenological experiences. And now that I mentioned at least how Descartes uses subjectivity, I want to mention also something which phenomenology was absolutely instrumental in developing and outlining, was that in how the subject-object distinction was used before Descartes, in the pre-Socratic and the Socratic sense of it, people like Plato, people like Aristotle, there's no distinction between subject and object. The subject was not held as being a atomistic or even monistic sense of absolute worth, and everything else was that which was supposed to be compressed into it. Because in the Latin terminology that Descartes uses, subjectum and objectum, the objectum is supposed to be the way in which the human person processes that which they perceive. That's what they see. And there's so many mistakes which go into interpreting the history of philosophy that to use words like see, perception, cognition, all of these are so loaded with Enlightenment era terms and with scholastic terms. But when you try to look at people like Aristotle, you have to think of it in the Greek dasein of it. You have to think of what they thought of it. So in thinking of subject and object in that regard, the subject is that which you are trying to understand. It's not you. You are not a subject whatsoever.
It's the multitude,
if you're trying to perceive a chair, that is the subject, because that is which you are trying to understand. You're trying to piece it together. You're trying to find the unconcealment of essences where there's a faith which is associated there. And the objectum is the way that you construct it within your mind. So that perception, as I mentioned, all the removal of accidental characteristics, the eidetic necessity of it, that is the object, because you are having various forms of that perceived object exists within the same horizon of intentionality, and they're all indistinct from one another. But nowhere does the human person as an absolute sense of self-worth, as an absolute I, factor in whatsoever. In fact, the confusion which philosophy had is that Descartes treated the I as a subjectum because that was what was being analyzed. He didn't posit that the subject was absolute. He said that in trying to deal with his form of metalogical doubt, the subject is by and large what is being considered. You were considering the I. He didn't take that as some sort of transcendental or absolute self, because he said you can doubt yourself, but in the various associations which you form in the objectum or in slapping yourself hundreds of times, eventually the objectum will be confirmed that you are what is experiencing it, at least what you take as being the I. There's no sense of the soul. There's no sense of Christian philosophy in it whatsoever. And that was a mistake that philosophy made in the interpretation of Descartes, was that, well, he's a Christian, so obviously the I exists because God said so. But when you read Meditations, for instance, or On the First Discourse, you don't see evidence of that anywhere, that he takes the subject as being absolute. He takes that as the absolute in the sense of that which is being only considered irrespective of everything else, because that is what methodological doubt necessitates.
See, like, like, it doesn't necessarily have to do with just doubt, I think. If we want to take, I remember you said earlier, Brigadeiro, something about love, and if I'm not wrong, you were also talking about its relationship to the void. Now, Lacan and Jacques, not only do they often, well, maybe not them personally, but there's this one thinker from my own country, and he will come up from time to time. He's also like this neo-Hegelian Nietzschean thinker, Alexander Bard. And, I mean, he's really hit or miss, don't get me wrong, but he makes the claim that not only does the self not exist, but that we pretend it does for some kind of other, like, for the big other, basically, right? It's a very moot point. But also what he claims is that when we fall in love with another person, and this is, I think, where they align with each other, Zizek and this Bard guy, is that you do not necessarily fall in love with the contents or rather, you necessarily fall in love with the void that a person has. And that void, it could be the lack of self, lack of foundation. And together, when you connect, you feel a certain, not greater whole, but you connect over this kind of becoming something else. And the very basic, like, fact of this, well, not fact, but you can make it clear with Jacques' little joke or expression. It's like, if you love someone for one particular reason, or if you can point out a particular reason why you love someone, then you're not actually in love with that person. And the worst question a lover can ask you is, why do you love me? And the correct answer is, of course, I don't know.
I just love you. That's it.
Yeah, exactly,
That's
right?
it. There is no other bigger thing that I love you. There is so much which I cannot express in words, you know, like, that's the difficulties, you know.
Yeah, you uproot the richness of love and trying to abstract it into different qualities.
Idealizing this kind of concept, you know, is the worst thing, because you strip down basically what essentially it makes it so powerful, the uniqueness, you know, so to speak, in the sense that going back to what Briggs said, it's a bit more like, it's a dry thing, like what he talked about, but it's a very important thing in regards to the multitude of perception, you know, like love as essential is, let's put it this way. Today, what we have is this kind of construction of the individual as this kind of special individuals, but what instead in reality we have, if one observes, is carefully manufactured archetypes which are carefully presented as the acceptable ones, as the ones that you grow up with, you are educated with, you know. There is a series of archetypes which are mixed, mashed, and it's enough just to do a basic study in marketing, for example, to discover like how it works marketing. That's basically how it works today, the formation of the individual, rather than the valorizing the uniqueness of the subject is the constructions of ad hoc subjects, because if you have too many unique subjects, you end up with having too many complexities in regards to the market, you know. The market can go as so far to satisfy a certain degree of people. Now, going back to Briggs' idea, Briggs' talk in regards to Descartes, and a key point in Descartes, as when he talked about, is this kind of multiplicity of perceptions, so to speak. Like, instead of this desperate humanist ideal of the single, you know, human perception of the single, you also talked about that with the brain, you know, like the brain, Gerald Edelman, I think it's Gerald Edelman, I know Edelman is the last name. He was an immunologist. His research was like extremely of the extreme high level, and he made his idea that every development of the brain, every pattern, neural pattern of every human is unique. There is no single same pattern between humans, in the sense that how we perceive the world, how we perceive the subject, how we perceive the object is completely different from person to person. As again, there's multiple aspects which are loaded into that perception. There are multiple factors which render it so that you cannot slot them into commodifiable archetypes. That's the difficulties of capitalism, which it has, and which creates alienation, isolation, because in the end it cannot satisfy the individual. It can satisfy only the archetype, and it forces us to strip our uniqueness, our individual, to such a degree that we suffer for it, because we knowingly, in some ways, like we are like the flagellants, knowingly flaying ourselves, because the market, so to speak, is this only provider of what we can, of satisfaction, so to speak. And we forcibly strip ourselves painfully our uniqueness so to we can enter those archetypes, and that creates pain. That creates that's why the 21st century is the age of mental chronic diseases. Like,
definitely,
the 20th century was the age of bodily diseases. The 21st century is the age of mental diseases, because we are stripped of us, so to speak. Capitalism arrived at that point, which it completely fucked us over.
Definitely agree on that one.
Thank you so much for everything you just said, because that dovetails perfectly to what I was going to say. And I was going to say, as I wrote this down before we started this, because I thought this was a very interesting insight, which in the immediacy seems very objectionable and even very, very questionable by nature. But when you consider it, especially as it relates to the formation and development of individualism, makes all the more perfect sense, especially in context of what Maestro said. And so what I posited particularly is that the problem concerning individualism doesn't just pertain necessarily to the presentation of an atomistic self. Because as we've already shown with the very, very insightful contributions of Gallo, and then what little I had to contribute on the subject, is that there is no conception of the atomistic person.
Small contribution.
The atomistic person as an ideal is held in such a regard as to be nothing but a quintessential and social nicety at this point. There's supposed to be nothing which can go into it, because as we've all demonstrated, there are many fundamental problems in conceiving it in this way. Though, what I went on to say is that if we are to consider, for instance, the essence of philosophy, which is what we are doing, the formation and the development, the progenitor, if you will, of individualism, is the earliest form of philosophizing, the truest form of philosophizing, not positing concepts, not positing ideas, not creating elaborate structures, but trying to figure out the ways in which essences were held, especially within the Athenian concept or within the Athenian context, where all of these people had concepts of what justice was like, what people were like, what the human person was. That was the truest form of philosophizing, and most philosophers will agree that that is the highest form of philosophizing, because they don't have the same issues and they're not bequeathed the same problems and structures to which we had. They wandered. They were fundamentally nomads in this concept. They didn't try to create space. They didn't try to create houses or walls or anything. They were content just to roam around philosophizing. But now we don't have that problem necessarily. And why does that problem, or we don't have that benefit? Well, why does that benefit not exist anymore? Why do we have a problem with it? And well, fundamentally, we can take, since we're mentioning Deleuze in this instance, the way that he uses philosophy. He says that each individual concept or idea in philosophy is like a brick, and that in how we're born and how we're raised around houses. We have arborescent assemblages where we have all of these elaborate constructions. We have courthouses, we have houses, we have churches even that are constructed brick by brick. And what he says is that in the modern context, we need to take a brick and throw it through the window. We need to tear down assemblages. We need to tear down arborescent structures. We need to tear down top-down solutions, because those don't allow for philosophizing. Though, I must admit, he doesn't go far enough in this. He still wants to retain each individual brick which is formed. And how are bricks and concepts formed? Well, you can't have a brick which is formed without some sort of apparatus, some sort of structure by which to continue making concepts. A brick does not just exist within the wilderness. It necessitates tools. In the modern context, it necessitates factories, furnaces, something by which to create these bricks. And if we want to return to that noble philosophy, the truest form of philosophy which he holds within Difference and Repetition, but he also speaks of in such books as Nomadology and A Thousand Plateaus, we can't be content with bricks anymore. We need to reduce it to rubble, to dust, so that there's nothing left, no traces by which we can build any further assemblages. And what does this embody? What does this sort of post-structuralist mentality embody? Thinking of this in a way, and this is where we get to the really, really shocking part of it, but the entirety of philosophy is nothing but struggle. It is all struggle ever is. And to the average person who is listening right now, they will think, how is it struggle? How is thinking inherently a form of struggle? Well, let's look through it from different perspectives. Yeah. In struggling, in metaphysics, whenever you do metaphysics, how is the argumentation presented? How is my argument at the moment presented? Well, I have a conclusion. I have something which I think must be presented, correct? Mm-hmm. And I have all of you here who all have your own notions concerning
Definitely.
this. Well, what must happen? I must struggle with you in this regard. I must present myself. I must present my evidence, my knowledge, my understanding, the expertise. I must impose my power upon you, my understanding upon you, because you do not know. So that is a struggle in itself. If you and I get into a heated debate, that is a form of philosophical struggle. But also, in the formation of structures, for instance, there is inherent struggle within it. If you read Hegel, if you read The Science of Logic, for instance, he struggles so continuously with the development of his system. All of the false ideas which exist at his time, all the false notions, all of the false pretenses which one may have, he struggles with language itself in this regard. He has to define what he means by being, by notion, by absolute, by concrete, because all of these philosophers will struggle and continue to struggle with those concepts, and so there is a never-ending movement there. And I don't want to trivialize the sense and definition of how struggle is meant, because most people think of struggle, they think of war, they think of violence, they think of something very brutal, something very nasty, but struggle does not always necessitate that. And people like Nietzsche are very vital to that formation and that understanding of how struggle exists. For instance, if I wished to understand the essence of struggle, not only does it necessitate a great deal of thinking on my part, but it also necessitates a lot of preconceptions which must be refuted, a lot of ideas which exist there. So that is a struggle in and of itself. But trying to call to hand so much that exists there, this is where individuality emerges. And this is why I think it's very important to outline that even in the most trivialized sense, even if you don't want to accept that all metaphysics is a multiplicity of struggles, it is struggles insofar as it cannot be merely bound by certain definitions. It is not only just fighting. It can be schizophrenic in nature. Mm-hmm. It can be unfathomable struggles. You could be struggling against the Dasein to which you run up against. So in this instance, if you and I wish to philosophize, we have to go against what is usually called common sense, or public opinion on the matter. That is Dasein in this instance. That is a form of struggling. And so struggling needs to have, by necessity, as Maestro says, it needs to have that empty ideal by which we continue to follow. And so I outlined that Heidegger, who was one of the people that originally discovered this, and then the people who continue it, Ernst Jünger, Nietzsche also discovered it, Merleau-Ponty, Mishima, all of the various philosophers, Deleuze even, the people that conceived of this, they don't take struggle as being this sort of binding form of framing where they can't go anywhere beyond it. In fact, they are fine letting it be a subterranean process. They are fine letting it be a rhizomatic, as Deleuze would call it, where it exists within the background and it's phenomenally important to the function of philosophy, but it is not the arborescent. It is not does not have to be explicit in order to continue existing. Philosophy does not need
it's one
to
of
know.
The many.
Yes,
it's one of the many processes.
Philosophy does not need for it to continuously recognize it as in a form of struggle. It needs to recognize it insofar as it continues, as it gets on the path of possibly losing it. But philosophy in and of itself can continue to function in the form that it is in. And that is why I think it is immensely important to recognize it as struggle. Because how does individuality emerge? Individuality emerges in and of itself from the attempt by social phenomena or the positing that one may have of their own notion with all that exists there. You can think of the classic literary appeals of man versus self, man versus nature, man versus God, man versus, the nothingness, the postmodern, all of that. All of those are forms of struggling. And in dealing with individuality, it's at least important to bear that in mind, because so much in terms of conceptual and apparatus tools can be lost if you don't recognize that. But you also don't have to go to the point where you embrace a form of folkish nationalism where oh, well, all my life is a struggle. I must be devoted to the struggle. I must labor ceaselessly. I must become an Uberman. You don't have to have the trivialized understanding of it that the National Socialists did. But you also can't just merely wave it away. You can't just say, oh, well, I am using an Enlightenment philosopher, and all individuality is noble and sweet and of itself. You have to take the good and the bad in this instance.
There are dickheads and there are good people.
I actually have a point about Nietzsche to make that sort of ties into that. So Nietzsche essentially has the idea of affirmation of life, by which he means that if we affirm one single moment, we affirm not only ourselves, but all existence, because, I mean, all of the points leading up to that point, which we affirm, must have occurred in that order, no matter how horrendous or no matter how beautiful, in order to get to that point. So in that sense, you affirm everything prior, and there is no negation, and it seems that there is no struggle. I might be incorrect in saying that, but I'd like your take on that, Brig.
So, and how Nietzsche uses affirmation. Yes, when you take a particular moment or a particular horizon of intentionality, and you deal with that, and you affirm the most beautiful. If, for instance, you affirm that marriage is the best thing in your life, according to Nietzsche, as Gallo said, he's completely correct in saying that you must affirm everything else. But what exists in that notion of affirmation is that all of the struggles to which you have dealt with, they're not explicitly, and I try to warn against this because this is very conceptually difficult for the modern man to think of. Struggle does not always have to be a negative thing. In fact, Nietzsche thinks that it is a very positive thing because it continues the affirmation which you have. You cannot have a proper form of affirmation or a proper understanding of life if you do not have suffering and struggle to some degree. So in the act of affirmation, you do not need to explicitly have struggle there. If, for instance, you buy a new car and you knew all the time and labor, all of the pain which you had to go through to get to that car, and it's a very expensive car, you will want to affirm the good which the car represents, the beautiful, the just, the prosperous, all of your goals realized there. And you do not necessarily have to affirm the bad. You don't have to think of all the pain and suffering you did during that time, because even though Nietzsche may seem confused and most people may think of him as a naysayer, as being pessimistic by nature, he actually wants you to take solace in those fleeting moments. But he also wants you to bear in the back of your mind, and this is the complexity of the will which he posits, that in that particular moment of affirmation, all the struggle which exists there is subterranean. It is, as I said, rhizomatic by nature. It does not need to be ready to hand, or does not need to be immediately in front of you, but it is still standing reserve. If something bad happens to that car, well, you think, well, I wasted all that time and all that energy, and it's all for naught now. So within Nietzsche, in the affirmation, you don't want to affirm the bad, or you don't want to individuate. Actually, no, you do want to individuate the good in this instance. You want to take it as a atomistic instance in time in which it is separated from everything which preceded it. But your condition as a human person, as a man, must necessarily, even if only incidentally or indirectly, affirm all that happened, because otherwise, to imagine that the car fell out of the sky for you and that is the best moment of your life completely negates everything that existed. He would call that a slave morality, because that does not demonstrate that you have truly learned to appreciate the beautiful.
Okay, so when Nietzsche says that nothing is self-sufficient, and neither in us, ourselves, nor in things, and if our soul has trembled with happiness and sounded like a harp string just once, all eternity was needed to produce this one event. There is a struggle.
Otherwise, you wouldn't understand the beautiful if you didn't have struggle. He would just say that you're grasping what your senses are telling you is beautiful, but you don't have any sort of real cognizant discernment of what the beautiful is in that instance, because your will has not developed to such a point where you can differentiate the harmful and the beautiful. And this is what Kierkegaard said is the reason original sin doesn't exist, because Adam and Eve didn't have a conception of what not to do something was like. They didn't have a conception of, no, don't do this, because they had never experienced it before.
You know what?
Okay,
It's
that's
like
interesting.
I'd like to echo you both on what you've said throughout like the last 15 minutes, especially in the part, Brig, where you talked about, you know, how we can't really look at a brick, but you got to look at the rubble, the dust. And before I carry out this like little monologue, I'd like to kind of give a pretty good picture, because we work best with pictures, especially when you're listening to like a
Yeah.
podcast or whatever. Imagine a diamond, right? And perhaps it isn't the best thing because it's completely consolidated with, it's crystallized by coal atoms. It's the most solid shaped.
It has the blood of the
Yes.
African children that found it and
Yes,
fought for it.
Exactly. But imagine, however, because it is transparent, it is very reflective. Call it a glass diamond, if you will. You throw it in the ground, right? And I mean, even people like Nick Landis used this as an example, but with an egg. So the diamond, because you have infinite force, you kind of just Thanos snap it into the ground, right? And it splits into infinitesimally small pieces. And these pieces are still, well, they used to be a diamond, they're still a diamond. Their essence hasn't really, like, changed that much. The atoms are still there. The bonds haven't broken down yet. But the thing is that now instead of just one reflection or one transparent, you have infinite amount of reflections. And I think I've found very few metaphors or idioms that come even close to describing the complexity of the brain, right? So in the very beginning, it's almost like you go through this process of being confined in a mother's womb, and then you come to this kind of canvas of pure novelty. And what is interesting in this kind of exposure, you have more connections in your brain than ever before. You start out with, well, you don't really start out with it, but the brain, you know, it has like 84 billion neurons approximately for most people. And the connections you make, especially in your younger years, where you learn language, where you pick up all of these subtleties that you lose the capability to later on in your life, you have maybe, well, trillions of connections. And the thing is, you're going to get a crystallized intelligence eventually. But this process of becoming something new never stops, right? But here's where it gets interesting. Because you're not just this empty void or whatever. And that's where I also like to echo you on like the struggle part of just not just existence, but like reality itself. So without going too long on this one, I'd like to use Zizek's idea of the ontological incompleteness of reality, right? And he uses the video game, you know, you can't go past the border, etc., etc. If we imagine life this way and apply it on every instance, on every little part of it, then we can look at just the body itself, the human body, any sentient creature with a brain, really. Here, you can immediately destroy Descartes' view of the subject, in the sense that the duality of man does not lie within the externality and the internality, the internal perception and the thing in itself, or the world outside, right? The duality of man exists in man himself with the, and I'm going to use V.S. Ramachandran, a kind of controversial but well-read and very certified neuroscientist. V.S. Ramachandran, some Indian neuroscientist, he had many revolutionary ideas. But here's one of his brilliant points, and it's that like you have the two hemispheres, and the right hemisphere, and it's funny because the brain works really in opposites here quite a lot. The right hemisphere is what he calls the left-wing revolutionary, and it constantly tries to challenge the status quo and bring about revolutionary change in your brain. This is the part that is probably most active when you're younger, right? Makes sense. Then you have the left hemisphere of the brain. And, you know, I'm not saying that there's a right brain or left brain. We all know that isn't true. But this is an aspect of the brain, how it works in oppositions, how it struggles constantly. The left hemisphere of the brain he calls the diehard conservative that just wants to do everything to uphold the status quo. Here's something interesting that happens. If you are a liberal, let's say, and you have a girlfriend that is pro-Trump or whatever, similar, and you want to be with this person, you love them, but this one thing really stops you from going all the way emotionally. And it causes you a lot of trouble.
Eat Paul cringe.
Yeah, exactly. And you experience something that pretty much everyone knows about, but perhaps haven't really tied into, cognitive dissonance. And this thing doesn't necessarily bring about revolutionary change all the time, but it is prevalent throughout, especially when you're in your final years of development, like in your teenage years. You have all these hormones and all these contradictory like neurotransmitters. Everything is chaos. And you're faced to do very difficult things that turn out to be very important for your life. And I don't think there's anything necessarily negative about this or anything positive about it. It just is. And here's this, like, the struggle I'd claim is not found just in like the incompleteness of reality itself within the subject or somewhere in between, but I'd claim that it's a pattern you will find anywhere, at any level, at any system that has any kind of complexity.
Sure.
And,
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
And struggle, therefore, I'd claim again, is a emergent property. It's not something that necessarily happens within the essence of a thing. It is ultimately existential.
Yeah.
Like you can't measure
the
the amount of consciousness something has, for example. There's,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Some people like to claim that you could, but so far you cannot do that.
No, everything's, it's on a sliding scale.
Yes.
Angry. I just want to make one point real quick. I would say that a struggle is inherent to an essence insofar as the way that we have to understand the essence. In fact, to posit an essence already necessitates that an emerging factor has already occurred. There's nothing to which we could claim has an essence which doesn't already have some sort of emerging factor associated with it. That's the only thing I would just want to add.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean.
A bit more, because I wanted to go into Deleuze after Maestro had something to say.
I mean, we can yap all day long about struggle and all sort of, but does today struggle belong to us? That's I think it's a key point which we should look upon, in the sense of, is the struggle something which belongs to us today? It's a process that we have in our head in some ways, like we can feel, I would say that seeing the issues that are keeping cropping out in every in every countries with different economical conditions in general, but that are all under this singular super economical structure, I would say that struggle does not belong to us anymore. Like, we need to artificially create this kind of macabre and perverse theater in which we try to emulate struggle, to create this kind of, we have no control over the actions we have, over the future we can gain. Like, we are so limited by the worldview which is presented to us. We are so limited by the places where we interact, so to speak. Like, we're so limited that we have this kind of obligation to assume a singular, identity in regards to how we approach these spaces. I highly suggest Luigi Pirandello, who is a writer. He was a playwright in Italy. He wrote a lot of texts, a lot of novels, of short stories in regards to identity and the concept of masks. And the thing is that I want to point with this kind of idea that we have to, struggle has become so alienated for us, so, completely stolen for us, because in the end we have no say, we have no power in the world where everyone says that we have this power as consumers, as citizens, and such on and so on. But it's so diluted. It's so how to say, idealized to a point which is painfully where we start to become painfully aware that it's not, and we have to play theater. We have to play the theater of struggle. We have to play the drama of struggle, because otherwise we would go completely crazy. We would lose it completely. Like we are at an incredibly dramatic, I would say, point in which, like, the actions we do are actions which are absorbed and completely repurposed. Nothing belongs to us. Like, it's enough to look at technology, how it evolves constantly. I mean, it's a very simplistic take, but again, like, people, like, even though there are some questionable takes, people like Mr. Ted and Uncle Ted and so on, where they talk about consent and technology, like, to who belongs technology today? Look at the electric cars. It doesn't belong to you. You are basically bound to a fucking server which will decide where you will go, how fast you will go. At the same time, it's the cell phones. It's your operative system on the computer. You don't control when you update it. It updates itself whenever it wants, because you are nothing. Your struggle is in vain. You will play the struggle, you know. You will play the theater, because otherwise, if we actually struggle, the world wouldn't be this way. The world would be a much more complex, a much more nuanced, a much more, I would say, even forward-moving machine, rather than the staleness we entered now today. Especially in the governmental systems, in the systems of management, it's all the same variation with a different color. In one place we worship the Benjamin, in another place we worship the Allah, but the process is the same. There is no variation, there is no differentiation. We try to move, but we're still stuck, because we still play the same act. Because for us, we are learned that struggle, how we play struggle, it needs to be played with some rules. Otherwise, it's not acceptable. And we are good kids. Otherwise, we're going to get a spanking from somebody. I don't know who, but there is somebody that we have this terror.
Bitch of our mother, if nothing else.
Exactly. You make very great points upon that, and I want to expound upon that. I think in how at least you present some of what you say, there can be tweakings always, and I know the nature of how this is, it's very difficult to have very polished and very refined presentations of what you think. The issue in which, at least how we see modernity today, is not only do we not know how to struggle anymore, the struggle which we have has been so heavily modified now that it no longer seems to be a struggle. It's a trivialized struggle. We've already long adapted to it since. You mentioned the staleness and the stagnation of modernity. The struggle to which the average man is submerged within on his daily existence is of the sort which he no longer develops. He stagnates rather quickly. And the only sort of movement forward that we see today necessitates and originates within a higher up within it. You have the CEOs that are initiating the change, countries, representative bodies, councils, associations, larger groups of people who can not only have the desire, but also have the ability, the struggle in a way in which they see it, and thus the limitations you have about our inability to struggle primarily stem from the over-reduction of how struggle was composed, I would argue, within the post-war period. And we can refer to people like Paul Virilio on instances like this, where the modern economy of capitalism is still centered around, it has never left the total war mentality of how Nazi Germany had. We are still within a World War II mentality in that sense, where there is a daily struggle, but the daily struggle doesn't originate within the man anymore. Man has long been abstracted from it. Man is no longer the summum bonum. He is no longer the highest principle of struggle. The struggle is continued growth of capital, continued movement of capital, continued development of margins and of trend lines in which it is trying to aim at forever. That is the struggle to which we have attained. That is what we have taken away from total war. Because, as you mentioned, we have to play within a certain rule set. And the West was not very pleased in how Germany tried to circumvent. Mm-hmm. How it tried to
circumcising time.
I must admit, to use circumcise, that is a very great Freudian slip, and I think you could actually have a good conceptual understanding with that. But nevertheless, and how Germany attempted to circumvent international law, how it was undefined at that time. The League of Nations was impotent primarily because the rules had not been codified enough to prevent that struggle. The struggle pervaded from all aspects of the economy. And people that you mentioned, those sort of authors who lament the lack of struggle, you mentioned Ted Kaczynski. And I swore you're going to mention people like Julius Evola, because Julius Evola is necessary to try to understand from a human perspective how struggle has gone beyond us primarily. That people are very content to live a very, very basic struggle. I'm going to estimate that most of the people who are listening right now, and most of the people who are speaking at the moment and have been speaking as of today, don't have a very struggle-intensive life. We don't have to worry about hunting for food. We don't have to worry about how to heat our homes, how to remain warm, how to have clothing, how to have social relations. All of this, because of the struggle of capitalism, has rendered man in his particular nature incapable of struggling towards the beautiful. Only very, very few, the aristocrats of the soul, as Julius Evola says, are capable of that same struggle we used to have, the primordial struggle that we had, in a reified and redirected tendency. We are not content to sit around in modernity, primarily because modernity does not give us anything by which to struggle for. And thus, I believe it is important not necessarily to create your own struggles, because to manufacture your own struggles is of course necessary. Any single person who wishes to develop and to advance within life must do this. But more importantly, the nature of struggle today, the struggle which has been stolen from us, no longer is within us anymore. In philosophy, we don't have to struggle very much anymore. The struggle today is trying to maintain structures, trying to maintain the past. And we see academia work so furiously, so fervently to maintain the pre-existing structures, because postmodernism is seen as an inconvenience. People like Derrida, people like Deleuze, people like Foucault, the ones who outline the self-evident and critique the assumption, the rules that are made, the ones who are rebellious, but they really aren't rebellious when you consider the extent and the finality to which you can maintain within your rebellion. They're inconvenient because philosophy can't just go about maintaining Hegelian structures, even post-Hegelian structures. The nature of deterritorialization has set in so heavily with modern capitalism that to re-territorialize it, it has that empty signifier status. Deleuze, in the logic of sense, is quite explicit in outlining this. That in and of itself, every signifier which is posited and elevated is incapable of exhausting the totality of everything. And struggle is within this void which we can signify. We can return to those same sort of Volkish nationalism which existed then, where the struggle originates in the domination of the flesh and becoming as strong and as intelligent as you can be. But that is not a
basically pulling an Atomwaffen.
Yes, that is no longer the struggle which is necessary. That is, as one would say, a empty ideal to which you have no sort of attainment. It is, in the case of people like Lacan, since we're mentioning Zizek, it is an objet petit a. You're aiming at fulfilling a objet petit a, and the false jouissance which you develop and you derive is incapable of truly satisfying what you have there. So how can we maintain that struggle? And this is where we move into the next stage of the podcast. I truly believe that if you were to use some manner of accelerationism, that is the only struggle you could have. And the struggle is in all facets of reality. Not only are you trying to understand the nature of capital as relates to accelerationism, in letting it go beyond the traditional mores and frameworks we have, but also in accelerationism, the attempt to dismantle and go beyond all the traditional binaries we have erected, the traditional struggles which had erected those. And that is the only pure form of struggle we have now. And so, in trying to consider individualism, and as it's dovetailed inevitably into struggle in this instance, how do various political forms deal with individualism and with struggle? How does fascism deal with it? How does Marxism deal with it? How do the quote-unquote third positionist theories, or the ones which pretense to go beyond those form of radical politics, how do they go beyond it? How does neoliberalism deal with individualism and struggle today?
See, there's a million ways you can go about this, right? But I want to just go a little bit back and kind of come back to this diamond, if you will. And the reason that I want to bring it up is because, well, first of all, I'm going to talk about two highly controversial thinkers, so I need some abstract, some way to abstract away all the problematics and focus on the vital points here.
You're getting canceled, dude.
Prepare your shit, boys. The Twitter forks are coming.
I mean, I don't mind having Dugan on, or Nick Land for that matter. I mean, heck, Zizek wouldn't be bad either. But I'm saying,
I mean, I mean, we can bait Land I could like a fish hook and put a bag of amphetamine on them, like, you know, a bag of crack, and he will come like slithering here.
Yeah. I don't think you're gonna need a lot of amphetamine to get this point, but it's. So I'm going to start with a reference to Zizek and then a little bit into Dugan, and then we can really like tackle the issue at hand. So this idea of I had a conversation with a friend from Canada yesterday, and he asked me a lot of questions about Zizek in particular, but it's where I came up with the metaphor, and the point was to kind of visualize what not really just happens with the brain, but like how reality itself might be inherently, to at least some degree, subjective. And what I mean by that is not that, you know, everyone is God or some really woo shit. I'm not either saying this like pseudo-Kantian take that well, because we can't observe the thing in itself, we're just left with subjective interpretations of that reality. No, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying, what if reality itself is divided into these infinitesimally small little reflections of itself, and whatever you do, you will never be able to kind of capture some object representing the whole, right? So you're a subject within an already subjective frame of reference. So this is what basically Zizek proposes in his Sex and the Failed Absolute, his latest book that really like kind of, I would say, consolidates his views on dialectical materialism. So most people don't even know what that word means, because there is no clear definition of it besides the horrible writings of Joseph Stalin. I'm not talking moralistically here, by the way. I'm saying it's the worst.
What you're saying?
What am I saying?
We just lost our entire ML audience.
The red horde. Exactly.
No, don't worry. I think Emil's agreeing with me that...
I mean, let's put it this way. Put it this way. Stalin writes well. He doesn't write in the sense he writes. He's a good demagogue. He's a good talker. He's a smooth talker. You know, he can talk the panties out of you. Even if you don't wear panties, you are gonna wear panties anyways. But what he talks about is like this kind of meme-worthy content. You know, like it's this kind of, why are you wasting your time on here? I know why, but again, I don't want to further alienate the educated MLs that manage to resist and not read themselves out of existence, basically.
To be fair, if they've gotten this far in the podcast, they're doing very well. I think they could tolerate quite a bit.
Further there, I'm just saying, like, it's not necessarily... Because, you know, Stalin was again, he was a demagogue. He was a spiritual person, or more... a religious person in the beginning, and you could argue whether or not he was consistent or pure in any regard with his robberies and participation in the revolution. But most people would agree you should never have touched a book, especially when you read historical and dialectical materialism. And I mean, I read that, and when I read like the first 2 pages of Zizek's new book, I realized like how detached that was from any kind of Grundrisse or any Marxist writing or any Hegelian writing for that matter. It was a very like objectivist, productivist mindset that had this, antagonism, and kind of like you had the negative and positive and then a synthesis or whatever, and history moves forward materially, blah 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 blah. But that's not at all what Zizek means. And I mean, I could bring up the book and go through his 6 points, but I want to focus on one of the points, which is that he doesn't view reality as this one objective linear thing that moves forward because of material conditions. Instead, it's a much more, I would say, pessimistic one, but also kind of, subjective.
Less boring one, apart from the road goes forward, that's it, and there is gonna be a stop, and we're gonna drink some mediocre coffee and then get sent to Gulag because we sent something bad.
Exactly, and I mean, I think more people can kind of vibe with it. It's not like this simple idea that's just too big for you to understand, but rather an idea that you can't really capture within the current confines of contemporary liberal ideology, language. It's like Heidegger said, it's not that we are language or that we create language. It's that, the words control us, ideology controls us. And the baseline of reality, according to Zizek, to a certain extent, is ideological, right? And we could talk about that a lot more, but that's for another time. But the idea, right? We come to the crux of it, and I kind of agree with Dugan on this one, regardless of how people consider him to be the most dangerous thinker of the world.
Okay, it is not Twitter.
Yeah, exactly,
okay,
right? But really,
that's a little silly.
Let's keep it.
His main claim is that the individual, first of all, he doesn't take the individual into account into his philosophy at all in his fourth political theory, but he says that one of the most limiting factors of liberalism, compared to itself, not compared to what he calls communism like Stalinism, or what he calls fascism with Mussolini, or even Hitler. I think he would call that fascism.
I think he includes National Socialism and fascism, yeah.
Definitely, and also a little bit of nationalism as well. But he doesn't, the liberalism compared to itself is limited in the regard that the subject, its main characteristic, is not some kind of identity, but liberty itself. And that doesn't necessarily even fulfill the requirements of being an individual, like tabula rasa or whatever. It talks a lot about negative freedoms, freedom from oppression and so on and so on, and not so much positive rights too, like healthcare or education or anything like that. And he proposes that we should go outside of that, right? And that's also the claim of Zizek. People call him like a third positionist or like some kind of a like racist or essentialist, but that's not at all the point.
Bro, he got the N-word pass. Zizek, I don't know if you watched the video in Big Think. The channel Big Think.
Yes, I've seen that.
Yes, it's a good joke.
Exactly.
It's great.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like, guys, go beyond your bullshit identitarian like limitations of Twitter because he's a fascist because he does X, Y, Z. Guess what? You do the same thing.
Live that
I should call you a fascist too.
Inducing inevitable friction on your own psyche and on other people, and between yourself and other people. Yeah. Like, I mean, putting on an aura of PC just is. When interacting with others.
Exactly. One day you're gonna wake up without pants in some weird place, asking on Twitter for $400 because you spent all of them on some North Korea convention. I mean,
that's about where I was going.
How cringy it can get.
No, I tell you how cringy it can get, right? Imagine being O.J. Simpson. You kill your wife because he's being, your wife is performing
he has a gamer
infidelity.
Moment.
He has a gamer moment, and in court, he has all of this money, and he says, his lawyer says, well, if the glove doesn't fit, acquit. And that's it. He goes free, and he lives his life talking about football on Twitter, as if nothing happened. And I mean, it's funny to a certain extent. We could that's a topic I want to have for another day, but we're really unironically approaching some kind of a post-truth. Like, forget all about like postmodernity or the idea that we don't have an overarching narrative. Like, at least we can accept some kind of subjective aspect of reality. But in regards to that, like, we have all kinds of narratives, we have all kinds of ideas that kind of pollute each other into this, I would say, almost global global
neoliberal ideological slush.
Yeah, slush, exactly, and it's boiling over. And like, again, because we have conservative right-wing governments in like Australia, entire forests are burning down. They're going into each other, creating mega fires, and they still say, this isn't global warming. This isn't anything else. It's just crazy people going into the forests and lighting shit on fire. And I mean,
it's those fucking greenies,
yes,
mate.
And
it's those fucking
fucking greenies. And it's not that they just ignore the problem. They double down. They say, you know what? Let people enjoy their own, like, New Year's Eve. We're going into a new decade. Let's go out with a bang. And yeah, guess what? It made it worse, because if you throw a bunch of fireworks into a very dry forest with 50 degrees Celsius, then accidents are bound to happen. And yeah,
I mean, he said the bang.
Exactly.
At
Exactly.
least
It was being honest. But these phenomena are just things acting upon themselves. Like, it's not part of some global conspiracy. And I think it's time that we kind of move beyond this kind of mindset that we stole from the 20th century, and even before that. We have to move beyond pure objects, and focus on what you wanted to say.
Process.
Exactly, the process, right?
Okay, so this is great, because this is dovetailing into something else I wanted to talk about. So, for the concept of truth, since you mentioned post-truth, I just wanted to provide a bit of a historical analysis here.
All right.
So much for me being the dude that studies history.
The way that truth and untruth was defined within Greek philosophy is not as binary as we understand it today. In fact, truth was considered a bad thing in Greek philosophy. And to the modern observer, this is unfathomable. Truth is absolute. There's nothing beyond truth whatsoever. However...
Are we talking about the sophists?
No, we're not talking about the sophists.
They're big gay.
So I'm talking about Plato.
Is this death grips?
Sorry,
Continue.
So, for within truth and untruth specifically, truth was considered by people like Plato the allegory of the cave. The immediacy of what was presented, that was truth, because there was no truth beyond that. That's why it's considered negative, because without the concept of untruth, which is unconcealing or inframing or presencing, however you want to use the terminology. If I am just to look at another person and I don't know anything about it, I've never experienced a person before, the truth is that you think they don't exist fundamentally. You think it's a reflection of yourself. And truth is bad in that regard, because you don't have any sort of comprehension whatsoever of it. Untruth, in fact, is much better, because when you have untruth, you have faith within what you believe to be, in today's conception, as truth, as being the reality of the matter at hand. Truth denotes within Greek philosophy that you are, within Hegel, at a stage of immediacy. You have not gone beyond the necessary properties which negation possesses. You are at not only the immediacy, but you are at the initial form of self-consciousness that exists. You see a tree...
Monkey level.
Yeah, monkey level, exactly. You see a tree, you realize you saw a tree, and you're certain you saw a tree. That's all that happens within that process. That's the entirety of truth within the Greeks. The untruth is far more optimal in this consideration, and I personally believe that we ought to return to considering untruth as being possible. Because within how untruth is defined, this is what we conceive of as a truth and untruth in the modern regard. It's a combination of both. They weren't mutually contradictory whatsoever. let's say I mistake Gallo for Maestro for some reason, and I've seen both of them. Let's say somehow they look very identical to one another, and I mistake Gallo for being Maestro. I have a familiarity with Maestro, so that when I begin to interact with Maestro, for instance, I believe that Gallowglass is Maestro. And if Gallowglass tells me I am not Maestro, I am Gallowglass, well, then the familiarity I had was in actuality an unfamiliarity which lurked within the back of my mind, but I presented it as a form of familiarity in a very narrow sense of it. So within the Greeks, untruth necessitates a form of faith. This is where the Christians derived the logos from as being the absolute truth, because in its original composition, logos was an instrumental part in how untruth was defined as. For untruth in this particular instance, the untruth in today's standard is, I thought Gallowglass was Maestro, and he's actually Gallowglass. But the situation at the hand is I'm unfamiliar with Gallowglass. I thought he was Maestro, and I conducted myself in a false horizon of intentionality in this regard. Mm-hmm. And thus, the truth which I derived was in actuality a non-sequential truth. And today's standard, you would say, well, there is an absolute truth hidden behind that, and all you had was appearances and mere semblance. But the nature of how the Greeks thought in this particular instance, and this is why the post-truth that Angry speaks of is necessary, is the positing of truth or actuality in this instance was only done for a formal aspect. It just conducted thought or your actions in and of themselves. But to take truth as being an absolute and being unflexible, unmoving, this is primarily derived from Christian philosophy. In fact, that is a negative aspect of being able to conceive it. Because if you approach modernity today and everything that goes into truth and untruth, the post-truth that Angry speaks of is in fact the nature of untruth bearing itself through the inability for quote-unquote absolute truth to adapt to the variety of how truth functions in and of itself. So I don't think we should be limited by the signifier of truth and untruth anymore, because frankly, it is a meaningless distinction which does not necessitate or engage anything. It is actually very contrarian to the nature. So here we get into Deleuze, who I wanted to mention, where instead of focusing upon, well, we need to get to the essence of things. We need to find the being of it. We need to find the truth, the hidden rational kernel maintained.
The form,
the identity. Yes, this is how Deleuze says it, identity. We need to be content with the understanding that the only form of identity we have is predicated upon absolute difference and upon the virtual. He says that the virtual is superior. The virtual is superior to the real because the real will always fail to meet our expectations. It will always confound us about how the virtual which we projected managed to be so pitiful, so pallid in nature to what we have attained within the real. And we can even get to Lacan for this, because Lacan is very instrumental within this as well. But
why does it sound like it sounds like a very, complex metaphor of saying I went to a bar, got fucked drunk, and got laid. But afterwards I discovered what I got laid with, it wasn't that much worth it.
Well, within the way that untruth was, that's a very unrefined way of putting it. I wanted to put it in a way which would be more understood from Greek philosophy. But the point I'm trying to make here, because I want to tie this back to the original statement that I made about accelerationism being the only real form of struggle that we have. If we don't try to impose identities or essences or familiarities or arborescent solutions upon certain identities or principles or phenomena, if you will, and we go into a post-structural political context, well, truth doesn't just become the signifying factor of anymore. There is something else which is elevated, which necessitates a form of struggle. Because truth, in and of itself and how we take it, is a very, very basic and uninspiring form of struggle. The National Socialists who embraced the form of struggle, which gave way to being incorporated into Italian futurism much later, at least in the 1930s as opposed to the 1920s, the way that was embodied was it was no longer focused upon truth as an absolute. The way absolute which was taken was conflict, was speed and acceleration. And if we take that in this regard, then we can properly go into, as Deleuze says, where we only focus on the virtual. That's the only thing we aim for. We don't care if we attain the real, because the real will always be inferior to the virtual. And even in the positing of a virtual, we can't have this elaborate horizon, this elaborate aesthetics, which politics inevitably falls into because it tries to embody some sort of eschatological end goal. It always comes back to Christian philosophy, ironically enough, and how we conceive of modern philosophy, modern politics, so on and so forth. We need to go beyond that. That conception is completely outdated, it's antiquated, and it does nothing but limit the human person in struggle and in movement. If we elevate it to such a point where the inhuman culminates with the human, and the human becomes indistinct from the inhuman, that is great. The only identity which should exist, and this is how the nature of postmodernity, but modernity taken as a social apparatus is that there's no longer coherent identities. Like Maestro said, like we said about individualism. Individualism is dead. It is nothing but an abstract and empty idea. It's much like how Foucault says, where the death of God did not produce man, but it also produced the death of man. The only thing that we can have now is absolute death. And how is death predicated? Death is a difference to everything that we know of. Nothingness is a difference to everything that we know. That should be the only absolute identity. And how does accelerationism embody that? Ideally, a techno-singularity where everything contracts into pure difference, pure rhizomatics, a body without organs, so nothing is structured in the same way anymore, but also there's a coherent unity there, which philosophy aims at attaining, but is incapable of doing so by positing positive and active identities.
You know, like I know that, Gallo, you wanted to say something, right? But before you do that, I'd like to say that somehow, and I'm not sure how, but given the meme value of this particular thinker, perhaps it is his polemics or what it could be, his mustache or his connection to Rojava, Apo taking all the cred. But Bookchin, in his book, The Philosophy of Social Ecology, essays on dialectical naturalism, he had a very nice kind of, well, I don't want to overuse the word, but synthesis of this kind of everything is difference, and everything is, in its connections, but also that, every little thing moves in an almost kind of rhizomatic structure. Not in the way in itself, like how it is constructed, but the fact that it has a code, it has a direction, but because of all the external factors, what it was going to be in its development, its destiny, it had to change path. And because of how complex reality is, these paths change all the time to the point where you don't know really when it started, when it's going to end, and which direction it is going. And so you can't really use any kind of untruth or truth or way to describe a particular point in reality. You can't even use Niels Bohr's, it was actually Heisenberg's, never mind, sorry, idea of the uncertainty principle. If you use these kind of signifiers, it kind of highlights the problems of trying to do this, like with absolute, with essences or whatever. It is possible that you can have different identities in its differences, but that these differences kind of also break down in its connections. You're never gonna know like a past or a future to a full extent, and that's obvious, but it's not that we can't know, or that we can know but we never arrive there. It's the fact that reality itself, again, might be subjective. And before I let you go on, Gallo, I'd like to also echo the point that you had earlier about, well, what if I'm talking to Maestro but I think it's Gallo, right? Here's the thing, right? If this idea of like dialectical naturalism, as he said, is true, then it might actually be the fact that in my world, Maestro, for all intents and purposes, are a Gallo, and that doesn't change until, Maestro comes up in the highlight, or Gallo for that matter, and exposes himself and makes him clear. He recognizes himself, and I recognize him. Until that happens, you have like the Schrodinger's identity or whatever, and the mixture between the true and untrue.
Transcendental, the impersonal transcendental field, essentially.
Exactly. And what's funny about that is there is some kind of, I would not call it a truth, but let's call it a factoid, a controversial one. And if this subjective model of reality is true, that means that time is not only relative, it is subjective. And when I'm saying a sentence, that will happen in a different, like basically timeline than when you hear it. So there's always going to be this gap, always. And not a void, but a disconnection. There's going to be a very existential difference, but also a kind of transcendental connection simultaneously. We arrive at complexities that, for all intents and purposes, makes it kind of meaningless almost to deconstruct. And you know, if anything, it just signifies that we again need to move beyond these signifiers and structures. What did you want to say, Gallo?
Oh, okay. I was just thinking for some of our viewers out there who might not understand the implications of identity and difference, I could provide a practical example. So, take a apple, for example. You would take the identity as apple. Yeah. I mean, that's what you see when you look at an apple. But really, I mean, every individual fraction of time that you can mete out, I mean, the apple is changing in some form or another on a molecular level, a pre-molecular level. It's rotting. It's being exposed to different chemicals. It's never really one thing.
Exactly.
And you can sort of think of the world as pure difference in that sense. We're all becoming with the world, as Deleuze says. You can't really differentiate. Metaphysically speaking, you can't really justify differentiating these different aspects of the world. We're all sort of just growing towards or growing towards whatever, because we're rhizomatic.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny though, because like again, I think it was Maestro, you said it earlier, the idea that the 20th century was the physical pain, and now we have the mental suffering of the 21st century. And we all kind of grow up with this, Billie Eilish, dead inside, stone-faced, schizoid mentality. Not really, but you can kind of get that vibe when you go onto Twitter and all you see are all these wojaks. It's like, God damn it, don't take that shit away from me. It's like the only thing I had to differentiate myself from the, how should I put it, the apolitical normie. But if we really want to be assholes here and like further alienate ourselves from the audience, well, not the people that are listening to it right now, but if for some reason we got cancelled and shared all over the internet, what I'm about to say is probably going to be very triggering. So in Zizek's books, Like a Thief in Broad Daylight, he talks about the modern subject, the human, and its agency in the beginning, and describes a picture, like not really the postmodern condition, but a certain level of nihilism. And in this nihilism and all this political and spiritual confusion, you'll have basically something resembling Buddhism. And not that that's the idea, but basically his idea of reproductive hedonism, like the seeking of pleasure, minimizing of pain, and that you want to find a family, you want to reproduce, you want to do all that, and stay within the current society, not change it too much, but not let people suffer unnecessarily, and you all kind of agree to the social contract and let things be, a very hippie mentality, right? The problem with that is that most people in power do not follow this mentality at all. You have Machiavellian little conniving sons of bitches like Putin or Xi Jinping.
I'm gonna kill you if you use Machiavellian still again.
We're trying to get Dugan on here. You can't insult Putin. Come on.
I'm not insulting Dugan.
Don't insult Machiavelli.
I'm not insulting them.
Much more nuanced.
Machiavelli was actually a good thinker. Yeah, don't call him
Machiavelli. Here's the thing, right? I'm comparing them to the the hedonist subject, the nihilist, the egoist, or whatever, and like it's easy to look at the absurd of it. It's easy to just shy away at it. I'm not as negative as Zizek on this one, but the thing is that the people that are really in power and that are kind of benefiting off of this social inertia that liberalism has caused. It's a very totalitarian ideology in that sense, and I agree with Dugin in that you have, like with modern technology, you know more about people than the people know about themselves with data science, and you can quite literally control information, especially from Russia, from China with their own new internets, etc., etc. The idea of the individual as having a private field to begin with doesn't even exist. So as communists, generally, it makes sense for Zizek to take everything that we talk about to the public field, because we don't even have a private field to begin with. And only then maybe something can happen once we break out of that inertia. But
that's an interesting perspective, yeah.
So in that sense, I don't disagree with Dugin. I kind of find it interesting, though, that his main subject of the fourth political theory is the individual, which basically says that you are your ideas, and he believes in the realm of ideas that go way beyond him, but are also connected to the nation state, the geopolitics, and so on. He actually goes away from Deleuze, in his own words. And honestly, at that point, where do you actually connect the dots from every other previous ideology? Because that's the thing that I'm missing from his kind of conclusion. He says that he wants to go beyond fascism, communism, liberalism, go beyond individualism, and break out of this inertia, but kind of bring it back to the realm of ideas, the nation state, the national identity, and kind of have what we talked about yesterday, Maestro, if you remember, how the future of Europe will look like, and the civilization states with endless ethnicities. Could you kind of mirror that back? Because I think that would be a great addition to what we're talking about.
I mean, hold on. Let me go.
Sure.
Because I can probably do what you guys are talking about, since I have
that would be great.
something in mind. See, I would need to ask Mr. Dugin what he's thinking of there, because in the attempt to go beyond ideologies and what you mentioned, especially about the people that are in power, that will become more and more the norm. This isn't an isolated phenomenon. Yes. There will be more and more technocrats, more and more, I would call them inhuman and barbarous people as we would conceive of them now. And this kind of goes back to what I was trying to explain to you yesterday, Maestro, where the implementation of a social caste system is already in vogue into some degree. And like Angry said, where you can only associate with Wojaks and try to differentiate yourself from the normies, already that's a form of Deleuzian anti-production right there. You are already pacified, if you will, within your certain respective niche within the social environment, within the economic environment as well. And as we see now, the death of ideas, as Mr. Dugin wishes to go back to, is not necessarily just necessitated by the movement and the trends of politics in and of themselves, but it's the movement and trends, as we mentioned, of the individual. And we've spoken so much and in such great length about how individualism, as it was understood once, is practically dead. And I think Maestro made a great point about this, that individualism in and of itself is practically neutered. The only identity you can have is differentiated depending on your consumption habits and the way you present yourself within a social apparatus. And thus you are already pacified based on your socioeconomic status. And I invite everybody who is listening now to go and look up the rates, the percentages of social mobility, and see the significant downward trends really since the implementation of industrialism across the entirety of the world, primarily, or at least the core part of it, aka post-World War II or post-war economics. If you look those up, it becomes more and more evident that unless you are significantly qualified and you are meant to stand out in differentiation to that, you won't escape where you are economically. If you're very well off, there is a strong likeliness you will stay there, even if you're a complete blockhead and a complete dolt. your family will still support you and keep you there in the inevitability that one of your kids will pick up the slack and they won't be as hedonistic and indulgent as you are. But if you are poor, I'm almost fairly certain that the percentage is 97% of people don't leave poverty, essentially. If they were born into it, they are within a state of perpetual poverty. And thus, as you mentioned, the civilizational state, the technocrats will consolidate their power, as we see within China, and this is the reason China is actually quite stable at the moment, is that the people who are maintained within the poverty and the ones they raise above the poverty line, it is solely and exclusively by their interest and by their want to gain and derive legitimacy. For the number of 800 million people being lifted out of poverty within China, that's by no means philanthropic and humanistic in nature. That is because China does not have elections.
Yes.
The government is not legitimized by elections. It is legitimized by what it can do for the average person. And thus, the average person is quite loyal to the Chinese government, even if they leave China. Unless you are stupidly wealthy and you leave China. If you are a grad student in the United States, you are at a point where you are completely loyal to the People's Republic of China. You will never, ever lose that unless you are Western educated by nature. And then you get into the whole false sentiment of individualism, which completely detracts from the notion of a civilizational state. But the civilizational state and the political state which we are in, Mr. Dugan is correct. We have gone beyond traditional politics, and that's why we see neoliberalism in significant decline and possibly its death throes as, quote-unquote, the dominant ideology of the world. Because if you study economics, you will clearly derive that overly centralized and overly decentralized economies both fail in the long term. You need a mix of the sort between the two. And so, from my understanding of the fourth political theory, even if you don't use it in the way that Mr. Dugan does, the fourth political sphere will use corporatism most likely. That is the consistently solid way of maintaining a mixed economy that is inherently hard or soft authoritarianism, still committed to capitalist growth, but also committed to the averaging and bettering of the individual and poor person. So really, modernity and post-modernity, as we've spoken of it at this very moment, and the incoherency, the post-truth, if you will, the mediation and the going beyond binaries, beyond traditional mores, beyond traditional, oh, well, you can't be a communist or a fascist, you have to pick one or the other. The entirety of how politics and economics is situated now, and this can go back to my interest in wanting to discuss individualism and politics. Individualism and collectivism is dead. There's no going beyond that. We're not going to have self-sacrificing communist societies, and we're not going to have ANCAP, completely individualistic, hyper-individualistic, in fact, societies. We will have an incoherent mediation of the two. It'll be a medley, if you will, and they will be schizophrenic by nature. The people who are the most individualistic, so the cold-hearted technocrats and the cold-hearted politicians, they seem the most collectivist. Mm-hmm. They will do the most out of anybody in the world to bring up the average person. If you look at Xi Jinping's lifestyle and you look at how he got into governance, as much as I completely respect the man, he was through and through self-serving, and he was interested only in getting to general secretary to become head of China.
Yeah.
Yes, but how did he get there? He improved all of the provinces which he governed, and at the moment now, he is trying to industrialize and better the most rural parts of China. If you look up videos of Xi Jinping going into villages in the middle of nowhere in China, he does this because he is aware that to be completely collectivist is nonsense. That's what Mao tried to do, and China did not turn out very well from that. But even what Deng tried to do, where he tried to promote some manner of individualistic Western ideas in it, what did Yang Zemin do? He completely rolled those back. So within, I call it the post-structural political environment, where ideologies are not coherent in semblance to be as absolute and universal, to be the truth, if you will. The post-truth will necessitate that there is so much bending, so much incoherencies within governance that we won't really know what China is. China's not communist, China's not capitalist, China's not fascist. It's somewhere between the middle. And that is how Mr. Dugan is at least thinking of going beyond it. The fourth political theory, if you will. So I don't know necessarily whether you can go back to those ideals. I think the ideals he is trying to posit is a nation state, which is necessary in what China is. But even in the application of it, it seems so fruitlessly empty, but yet so abundant and so clear compared to the West that we cannot understand it. And we need to come to grips with the fact that we won't understand postmodernity, we won't understand individualism anymore, because the struggle to which we have turned now in an accelerationist method is of such a degree that only capital is what can be understood as being the driving mechanism of history today. And that by nature is inhuman.
Exactly. And it's funny because, you know, Dugin always talks about that Russia has its own truth and relative truth, or whatever you want to call it. But you know what? Like, when it comes to self-identifying and especially in terms of our own ideologies, like you could call ourselves, you know, liberals, the first position, the communists, the second position, and I don't think we're even, you know, the third position, or like fascists. Instead, I think we're somewhere.
We're the 69th position.
No, we're super positioned, right? And we're in a state of absolute duality. And here's the thing, right? I'm really glad that we didn't talk about Jordan Peterson, because that would just have been like philosophical suicide in a podcast about individualism. But honestly, to end this on a little bit more of a optimistic note, you can take your own individual responsibility and give this podcast a thumbs up, subscribe, buy some merchandise, and trust me, we will recognize you, we will appreciate you, and maybe we will even bring you on the podcast. And
not gonna
that's
happen.
not going to happen.
Not gonna
Probably
happen.
not.
Your
But
name is
maybe.
not Alexander Dugin. You're not getting on here.
If you're lucky,
Okay,
you might
maybe.
get some extra material on Patreon once we set
If
that shit
you're
up.
redheaded, hot, and have double D's, then yes.
Oh,
Yes.
Yes.
gentlemen,
Sexism.
any
Oh,
final words?
Of course, we end up like, yeah.
I
Let's
just want to
reflect
say,
it.
and with this podcast, the process of making you into an inhuman, schizo, sleep-deprived, self-worrying, completely incoherent schizo is being realized in this sort of podcast. And the thing you must remember
Said
is...
schizo twice, and that's good.
That's good, yes. That's perfect. Schizo, schizo, schizo. That is the theme which is reinforced so often in this podcast. But the thing you must remember is, no matter how much in the world seems empty and bleak and drask and dreek and bleary, remember what I said originally. Be an anarch, and that is what superpositionism is, by and large. The anarch, even if that gives you only a minuscule hope of actually having meaning within the world. Superposition is a reminder. You are not like the other fools who pretend that neoliberalism or anything else will make a comeback. You are aware that capital is turned towards the inhuman, and you are willingly embrace that. And perhaps, just perhaps, you may be rewarded a sweeter death than everyone else is.
I'll drink to that. That has been all for the Pseud Central podcast. Thank you, and goodbye.
We wish you a good day.
Thank you.
And fuck off. We are
Mashallah.
not
Have a good
kidding.
day.
We're not kidding when we're joking.
That's right.
Goodbye.